The shuttle docked with a low hum and Kael Morrow stepped out carrying nothing but a warm leather bag and a steel thermos that had more dents in it than a war zone ambulance. He stood still for a moment and looked around. Veylith Orbital was the most advanced medical station in the known galaxy, and it looked like it too. Walls that glowed soft blue with bioluminescent panels and corridors wide enough to fit species 3 times his size and floating holo displays showing anatomy charts of creatures he had never seen before in his life. Kael took a slow breath and whispered to himself, "Well, this ain't a field hospital." A voice clicked behind him, sharp and precise like 2 stones tapping together. "You are the human." He turned around and saw Tessic for the first time. A Veylani standing almost 2 heads taller than him with a hard exoskeleton that shimmered dark green under the station lights and forearms folded tightly across their chest and compound eyes that reflected Kael like 100 tiny mirrors. Kael smiled and said, "That's me, Dr. Kael Morrow. You can just call me Kael." Tessic did not smile because Veylani faces could not do that, but the way their antennae flattened slightly told Kael everything he needed to know. This alien was not impressed. "I am Tessic, first rank medical student of the 41st intake cohort. I've been assigned as your orientation guide. Follow me and please try to keep pace." Kael followed, and he did have to try because Tessic walked fast on their long segmented legs, and every few steps one of their 4 arms would tap something on a floating datapad without breaking stride. The corridors were filled with students of every shape and biology Kael could imagine. There were tall crystalline beings who moved like living glass, and short dense amphibians whose skin glowed with shifting colors, and massive fur-covered quadrupeds who rumbled deep sounds as they passed, and every single one of them paused for just a second to look at Kael with something between curiosity and pity. "The human," they whispered. "That's the human observer." Kael just kept walking and kept smiling. Tessic led him to a wide observation hall where a group of senior students were gathered around a holographic display showing a full-body reconstruction of some species Kael did not recognize. Their professor stood at the center, tall and thin, and made of something that looked like living crystal. Every movement sent tiny refractions of light scattering across the walls. "That is Instructor Veylith," Tessic said quietly. "Sorvasi species, one of the most respected medical minds in the Galactic Union. Do not speak unless spoken to." Kael nodded. Veylith turned as they entered and looked at Kael with eyes that were just smooth planes of pale light. No pupils, no iris, just light. "The human representative, welcome to the Academy. We are pleased to have an observer from one of the newer Union species. I trust you will find our methods educational." The way Veylith said educational made it very clear what they really meant. "Primitive creature, come and see how real medicine works." Kael just nodded again and said, "Thank you, instructor. I am looking forward to learning everything I can." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the students later. That evening, Tessic walked Kael to his quarters, a small clean room with a bed that auto-adjusted to species weight and a window that looked out into the stars. Kael set his bag down and put his thermos on the table, and Tessic lingered at the door like they had something to say but did not know how to say it. Kael looked at them and said, "Go ahead." Asked. Tessic hesitated, then said, "I read your file. It said you performed a surgical operation on a moving vehicle during a conflict zone on your homeworld. Is that true?" Kael sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Yeah, armored transport. Soldier had shrapnel in his gut, and we were taking fire and the medevac was 40 minutes out, so I opened him up right there in the back of the truck and pulled the metal out and stitched him shut while the driver was swerving through a bombed-out road." Tessic stared at him. "You cut him open inside a vehicle while under attack?" Kael shrugged and said he lived. "That's what mattered." Tessic was silent for a long time, then said, "That is the most disturbing thing I have ever heard. Our medicine has not involved direct physical incision in over 900 years. We use nanite infusions and bioresonance fields and cellular reconstruction. The idea that you would use a blade on living tissue is they trailed off. Kael finished the sentence. For them, barbaric Tessic did not deny it. Kael smiled, and there was no anger in it, just a kind of tired patience, like a man who had heard this 100 times before and would probably hear it 100 more. Maybe, he said, but when everything else fails, and the power is out, and the machines are broken, and someone is bleeding out in front of you, a blade and steady hands are the only things in the universe that still work. Tessic left without another word, but Kael noticed that their antennae had shifted from flat dismissal to something else, something almost like the beginning of doubt. Over the next few days, Kael attended lectures and observed procedures and took notes in a small battered notebook that made the students stare because nobody used paper anymore. He watched as nanite clouds repaired fractured bones in seconds and bioresonance fields sealed internal ruptures without a single mark on the skin, and cellular reconstruction chambers regrew entire limbs in hours. It was extraordinary, and Kael said so openly and honestly. He was not pretending, and he was not jealous. He genuinely admired what they had built, but he also noticed something that nobody else seemed to notice. Every single procedure required a machine. Every single treatment depended on calibrated technology and loaded species templates and stable power and control environments. There was no backup, and there was no plan B when he mentioned this to Tessic one afternoon over coffee, which Tessic found disgusting but was slowly becoming curious about. Tessic waved it off with 2 of their 4 hands. Why would we need a backup? Our systems do not fail. Kael took a sip from his thermos and said nothing, but his eyes, for just a moment, looked the way they used to look right before the shelling started. Then, 3 days later, the emergency alarm went off across the entire station, and everything changed. A low, deep chime echoed through every corridor and every hall and every room in the academy, a sound that Kael had never heard before, but understood immediately in his bones. The way every medic in every species understands the sound that means someone is dying. Instructor Veylith appeared on the holo display, calm and precise as always, and said there has been a structural collapse in Habitat Ring 7. Senior cohort, report to staging area immediately. This will be a live observation exercise. Tessic looked at Kael, and for the first time their compound eyes were not calm. There was something flickering in them, fast and electric. Kael set down his coffee and stood up, and there was a shift in him that Tessic had never seen before. Something quiet and hard and absolutely still, like a man who had just stopped being a guest and started being something else entirely. Let's go. The habitat ring was chaos. Kael could smell it before he could see it. Dust and scorched metal and something sharp and biological that his brain filed under blood, even though it probably was not blood in the human sense. Every species bled different, but the smell of a body broken open was universal. The magnetic scaffold had come down hard, a massive frame of interlocking metal beams that had been holding up a section of the market district during renovation. Something had failed in the stabilizers, and the whole thing had folded inward like a giant fist closing, and it had crushed a row of vendor stalls and caught everyone underneath. Station medics were already on scene handling the minor injuries. A trucky merchant with a cracked shell and a pair of small furred divery children who were crying in high-pitched whistles while their parent held them. Cuts and fractures and shock. Bad but not deadly. The deadly one was in the center. The senior cohort arrived, with Instructor Veylith gliding ahead of them, and the students fanned out with their scanners and medkits. Tessic was at the front, their 4 hands already moving across their datapad, and Rin was right beside them, their amphibious skin flickering between nervous shades of pale violet and white. Then they saw the patient, and every single one of them stopped. He was a Gorvathi, a species Kael had only seen in data files until now. Massive, easily 3 meters long with 6 thick limbs. and dense scaled skin the color of dark stone. Gorvity were built like tanks, and they worked the heaviest labor jobs on the station because almost nothing could hurt them. Almost nothing. A jagged piece of the scaffold, a torn metal beam nearly a meter long, had punched through the Gorvith's lower torso and was still lodged inside, him sticking out from both sides like a cruel spear, the scales around. The wound were cracked open, and something dark and thick was leaking out slowly. And the Gorvithi was breathing in short, ragged bursts, his massive body trembling with each one. A Tessic scanned him, and their voice came out tight and fast. The fragment is lodged 2 centimeters from the secondary circulatory hub. The membrane is already showing micro tears. If it ruptures fully, he will lose blood flow to his entire lower body within minutes. Rin checked the station medic reports and said the nearest surgical suite with a Gorvithi-rated cellular reconstructor is 40 minutes out by med shuttle. Moving him in this state could shift the fragment and tear the membrane completely. Instructor Veylith stood behind him silent and watching with those pale light eyes and said nothing. The students understood. This was their test. Assess the patient, propose a plan, save the life. And that is when the panic started. Not loud panic, not screaming or running. This was the worst kind, the quiet, suffocating kind where brilliant minds hit a wall they were never trained for and started spinning in circles. Tessic ran the numbers on nanite infusion and shook their head. Nanites cannot bond with Gorvithi tissue without a calibration suite. Field nanites will be rejected by his immune response before they reach the membrane. Rin suggested bio-resonance healing, but another student pointed out the obvious. Bioresonance requires the patient to be still, and the Gorvithi was writhing in agony, his massive limbs scraping the ground and sending tremors through the floor every time he moved. Someone pulled out the portable cellular reconstructor and powered it on, and the screen blinked red. No Gorvithi template loaded. The device was configured for the 6 most common species on the station, and Gorvithi was not one of them. A student named Vorik, tall and scaled with 3 eyes, suggested sedation, but the dosage math for a Gorvithi of this mass was dangerously imprecise in a field setting. Too little, and he would keep thrashing. Too much, and his primary heart could stop another. Students suggested emergency cryostasis, but the portable cryo unit was rated for patients up to 200 kilos, and the Gorvithi weighed at least 400. The suggestions kept coming, and they kept failing, and the students' voices were getting faster and higher and more desperate, and Tessic was cycling through their datapads so fast that their forehands were blurring, and Rin had gone almost completely white, which for Adathri meant they were terrified. Someone said, "Maybe we should just call the shuttle and hope he survives the trip." Someone else said, "If we extract the fragment now, without repairing the membrane, he bleeds out in 90 seconds. Someone else said, "Then we cannot do anything, we just wait." And the Gorvithi screamed. It was not a sound Kael had ever heard before, deep and raw and vibrating through the floor and up into his bones. The sound of a creature in so much pain that his body did not know how to contain it. His 6 limbs locked rigid, and the metal fragments shifted inside him and on Tessic's scanner. The membrane tier doubled in size. The students went silent. Rin whispered, "His vitals are destabilizing. We are losing him, instructor." Veylith still said nothing. Their crystalline face was unreadable, but Kael saw something in the way the light refracted through their body. Veylith was not calm. Veylith was waiting for someone to do something that the textbooks had not taught them to don't. No one was doing it because they could not. Every tool they had required something they did not have. A calibration suite, or a template, or a controlled environment, or stable conditions. Their medicine was brilliant and advanced, and it was built for hospitals, not for a blood-soaked floor in a wrecked market with a dying patient and no time. Kael stood at the back of the group and watched all of this, and he felt something old and familiar rise up in his chest. Not adrenaline exactly, something quieter, something that had lived in him since the first time. He held a dying soldier in his arms and decided that doing something imperfect was better than doing nothing at all, he said. His thermos down on a crate, he rolled up his sleeves, and every alien in that corridor heard him say, in a voice that was not loud but carried like a blade through the silence, "All right. Can someone hand me a clean blade and something I can use as—" A clamp. The students turned to look at him, all of them. Tessic with their compound eyes wide and Rin flickering between white and pale blue, and Varric with all three eyes locked on him, and even Instructor Veylith, whose light shifted in a way that Kael could not read. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Kael stepped forward, and there was something in the way he moved that silenced every voice and every doubt in that corridor. It was not arrogance, and it was not bravado. It was the walk of a man who had done this before, who had knelt in mud and blood and fire and put his hands inside a broken body and refused to let death win. He knelt beside the Gorvathi and looked at the wound and looked at the fragment and looked at the scanner readout that Tessic was still holding in trembling hands. Then he looked up at Tessic and said very quietly, "I am going to need you to help me. Can you do?" Tessic did not answer for 3 full seconds. Then their antennae shifted forward, and they said yes. And Kael said, "Good. Now show me everything you know about this species' anatomy. Not the treatment protocols, just the anatomy, where the vessels are and what the tissue is made of and how this hub is structured. Tell me everything, and do not stop talking until I tell you to." Tessic started talking, and Kael put his hands on the dying alien. The first thing Kael did was put his bare hands on the metal fragment and hold it absolutely still, not with a stabilizer field, not with a magnetic clamp, not with any device at all, just his 2 hands gripping the jagged blood-slicked metal and locking it in place with nothing but muscle and willpower and the kind of grip strength that comes from years of holding broken bodies together in the dark. The Gorvathi flinched and let out a deep rumble of pain, and Kael said in a low, steady voice, "I know, big guy. I know it hurts, but I need you to breathe slow for me. Can you do that? Just breathe slow." The Gorvathi did not understand his language, but something in Kael's tone cut through the pain. Something old and calm and certain, and the massive creature let out a shuddering breath, and his trembling slowed just a fraction. Kael looked at Tessic and said, "Talk to me. What's the tissue density around the wound?" Tessic was shaking, but their training kicked in, and they looked at the datapad and said, "Gorvathi dermal layer is 11 centimeters of layered keratin scale over dense fibrous muscle. The secondary circulatory hub sits beneath the 4th muscle layer, approximately 19 centimeters from the surface. The membrane surrounding the hub is 2 millimeters thick and has the tensile strength of how strong is it compared to something?" "I can understand," Kael interrupted, "like human tissue. Is it like a tendon or like an organ wall or like skin?" Tessic blinked all their compound eyes at once and said, "Closer to a thick blood vessel wall. Flexible, but not elastic. It will not stretch. If it tears clean good," Kael said. "That's good. I can work with that." He looked around the scene and started pointing at things with his chin, because his hands were still locked on the fragment. "That stylus on your belt, Tessic. The magnetic one. Give it to me. And Rin, I need that roll of sterile fiber from the med kit, the thin stuff meant for micro-bandaging. And someone get me that metal bracket from the broken stall over there, the L-shaped one, and sterilize it with the field sanitizer." Nobody moved for 2 seconds now, Kael said, and his voice did not get louder, but something in it shifted like a door closing, and every person in that corridor understood that this was not a request. Rin moved first, their skin shifting from white to a focused deep blue as they dug into the medkit with fast, precise hands. Tessic pulled the stylus from their belt and placed it beside Kael. Another student scrambled to the broken stall and came back with the bracket, and Varric hit it with the field sanitizer. Without being asked, Kael looked at the tools laid out beside him and nodded. "All right." Here is what I am going to do, and I need everyone to listen. I am going to make a secondary incision 4 centimeters lateral to the entry wound to give me access to the membrane directly. I am going to use the stylus as a retractor to hold the tissue open. I'm going to use the bracket as a clamp on the membrane to stop the tear from spreading, and then I am going to suture the membrane, closed with the sterile fiber. After that, I will extract the fragment, not before Rin made a sound that might have been a gasp or a word in their own language, and said you are going to cut him open further, yes. With what Kael reached into his boot and pulled out a small folding knife. The blade was short and thin and impossibly sharp. He had carried it since his first deployment. It was not a surgical instrument by any galactic standard, but it had saved more lives than most machines on this station. He held it up to the field sanitizer, and the blade glowed briefly as the energy field killed everything on its surface. Tessic whispered, "That is not a medical tool, no," Kael said, "but it is clean, and it is sharp, and that is all I need right now. Tessic, I need your hands. You have 4 of them, and I need 2 of them to hold the clamp steady once I place it. Can you do that?" Isik looked at the knife, and then at the dying Gorvathy, and then at Kael. And something inside them made a decision that their entire education had never prepared them for. They knelt down beside Kael and said, "Tell me where to put my hands." Kael smiled, just a small one, and said, "When I say now, not before then." He cut the blade weighing clean and precise 4 centimeters to the left of the scaffold fragment. The Gorvathy's scales resisted for a moment, then parted under the edge. Dark, thick fluid welled up, and Kael ignored it completely. His hands moved with a kind of terrifying fluidity. No hesitation, no fumbling. He had done this 1,000 times in 100 different hells, and his body knew the work even when his conscious mind was mapping alien anatomy he had never touched before. He used the magnetic stylus as a retractor, pressing it sideways into the incision to hold the tissue open. The stylus was never designed for this purpose, but it was the right shape and the right size, and that was enough. Now he could see the membrane, a thin dark wall of tissue wrapped around the secondary circulatory hub, and he could see the tear, a ragged split almost 3 centimeters long with dark fluid pulsing through it in rhythmic surges. He picked up the L-shaped bracket and positioned it over the tear and said, "Tessic, now, 2 hands. Squeeze here and here. Firm pressure. Do not let go no matter what." Essex upper 2 hands came down on the bracket and pressed, and the tear pinched shut, and the pulsing slowed, and Kael said, "Perfect. Hold exactly like that then." He threaded the sterile fiber through a curved needle he had fashioned 30 seconds earlier from a broken scanner probe, bending the metal with his fingers while nobody was looking, and he began to suture stitch by stitch. He closed the membrane, his fingers moving in small, precise motions that the students watched with a kind of hypnotized horror. Each stitch pulled tight and knotted and placed exactly where it needed to be, and he talked the entire time. "The membrane is flexible but not elastic, so I am using interrupted sutures instead of continuous. Each stitch is independent, so if one fails the others still hold. The fiber is thin enough to pass through without causing secondary tearing, but strong enough to hold under the blood pressure. I am keeping the spacing at 3 millimeters to balance tension." Distribution he was teaching them, Rin realized, in the middle of surgery on a dying alien on a wrecked market floor with blood on his hands and a homemade needle between his fingers. He was giving a lecture. 7 stitches, 8, 9, 10. Kael tied off the last one and said, "Tessic, release the clamp slowly." Very slowly Tessic eased their hands off the bracket millimeter by millimeter, and everyone held their breath. The membrane held no leak, no pulse of dark fluid. The sutures sat clean and tight, and the secondary hub resumed its steady rhythm beneath them. Kael let out a breath he had been holding for 3 minutes and said, "Now for the fun part." He gripped the scaffold fragment with both hands and looked at Rin and said, "Watch his vitals and tell me if anything spikes. Then, In one smooth, controlled motion, he pulled the fragment straight out along its entry angle. The metal slid free with a wet sound that made two students turn away, and Kael immediately pressed a sterile pad over the wound and held. Pressure, though. Over this body shuddered once, a massive full-body tremor that shook the floor, and then when Stilren's skin flashed bright green, and they shouted vitals. Stabilizing, circulatory pressure normalizing, the membrane is holding. It is holding 11 minutes, Vorik said, staring at their chrono display. The entire procedure took 11-minute scale. Stood up slowly. His hands were covered in alien blood, and his forearms were shaking with the effort of what he had just done, and his shirt was ruined. He picked up his thermos from the crate where he had left it, and took a long sip of cold coffee, and the entire market corridor was so quiet that the sound of him swallowing was the loudest thing in the world. Then, the Gorvathi dockworker opened one massive eye and let out a low rumbling groan and said something in his own language. Just a few rough words Stesic translated in a whisper that shook. He is asking why his chest itches. Kael looked down at the Gorvathi and laughed. A real laugh, warm and tired and full of relief, and said, "Yeah, that means it is healing. Do not scratch it." And the Gorvathi closed his eye and his breathing steadied, and he was alive. Nobody in that corridor moved. For a very long time Ren looked at Tesic, and their skin was cycling through colors that had no name in any language. Kael knew, but if he had to guess, he would have said it was the color of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been turned inside out. Essek looked at their own 4 hands, 2 of which still had dark Gorvathi blood on them from holding the clamp, and they did not wipe it off. They just stood there and stared at their hands as if seeing them for. Nobody talked on the shuttle ride. Back to the academy, the senior cohort sat in silence. 23 students from 9 different species, each one replaying what they had just witnessed inside their own heads over and over like a trauma loop that would not stop, because it was trauma in a way, not the blood or the injury. They were medical students and they had seen worse on simulation tables. No, the trauma was the realization. Every single one of them had frozen, every single one of them. The best and brightest medical minds of their generation. Students who had scored in the top fraction of a % on entrance exams that most species could not even comprehend, had stood around a dying patient and done nothing while a human from a species that still cut bodies open with metal blades had knelt on a dirty floor and saved a life with a pocket knife and thread. That silence followed them into the academy and spread through the corridors like a slow shock wave. Within an hour, the entire station knew. The human fixed a Gorvathi with his hands, not with nanites, not with resonance fields, not with a reconstruction chamber, with his hands and a knife and a needle he made from a broken scanner probe. The whole thing took 11 minutes, and the patient is alive and stable. Tesic became the center of a storm they did not want to be another. Students swarmed them in the common halls and the dining areas, and even outside their quarters, asking questions that all sounded the same. What was it like? Did he really cut into the patient? Did you really help him? What did it feel like to hold the clamp? Were you not terrified? Essek answered the same way each time, and it was the truth. He was completely calm. He did not interface with any system or run any calculations or consult any database. He looked at the wound and touched it with his fingers, and he knew what to do. He just knew. The way his hands moved, it was like they had their own intelligence separate from his mind. I have never seen anything like it, and I do not fully understand it. In a quieter corner of the academy, Ren sat alone in front of a data terminal and pulled up everything they could find on human medical history. What they found kept them reading for 6 straight hours. Humans had been practicing medicine for thousands of years before they ever developed the technology that other species considered basic. They had cut open living bodies to understand how they worked. They had studied the dead. Actually physically open the dead and mapped every organ and vessel and bone by hand. They had learned surgery in wartime, battlefields and plague zones and disaster sites. Places where there was no power, no clean water, no tools, and the only thing standing between a patient and death was another human with steady hands and a willingness to try. They had made mistakes, terrible ones. They had killed patients learning how to save them. They had experimented and failed and tried again for centuries. Their medical history was written in blood, not metaphorically, but literally. Every technique, every procedure, every piece of knowledge had been paid for with the suffering of the ones who came before Rin. Read about a human practice called triage, the act of deciding in seconds who could be saved and who could not, who would get treatment first and who would have to wait. And they felt something cold move through their body because they realized that humans had been making that choice for so long that they had given it a name and a system and built their entire emergency doctrine around it. No other species in the Galactic Union had a word for triage because no other species had ever needed one. Their medicine had always been good enough to save everyone. But humans had spent their entire history in a world where saving everyone was never an option, and so they had learned to act fast and act now and live with the ones they could not reach. Rin closed the terminal and sat in the dark for a long time, and their skin did not change color at all, which for a Dothering meant something so deep it had no name. The next day, instructor Veylith convened a formal review in the main lecture hall. Every student expected the same thing. Kael would be reprimanded. He had performed an unauthorized procedure on a species he had never treated using improvised non-standard tools without any official clearance or supervision. It did not matter that the patient survived. Protocol was protocol, and the academy was built on protocol, but Veylith did not reprimand him. Instead, Veylith activated the holographic display and replayed the entire procedure from the scanner recordings. Every cut, every stitch, every movement of Kael's hands in perfect three-dimensional detail. And asked the students to analyze it, not judge it. Analyze it, tell me, Veylith said in their precise crystalline voice. At which points did the human deviate from standard medical protocol? The answers came fast because the deviations were everywhere. Unauthorized incision, improvised non-certified tools, no anesthetic, no sterile field generator, manual tissue manipulation, hand suture closure, and on and on. The list filled an entire display column now. Veylith said, "Tell me, at which points did the human violate core medical principles?" Room went quiet because the answer was nowhere. Every single thing Kael had done aligned with the foundational principles they'd all been taught in their first year. Assess the immediate threat to life, stabilize the patient, address the critical injury directly, minimize additional harm, act within the window of survivability. He had just done it all with his hands. Veylith let the silence sit for a long time, then said something that would be quoted in academy records for decades. Our systems did not fail today. They simply did not apply, and none of you had been trained for that possibility. This is not your failure. It is ours. Then Veylith dismissed the students and asked Kael to remain. The two of them stood alone in the empty hall, the crystalline instructor and the tired human with coffee stains on his shirt and alien blood still under his fingernails. Because he had not had time to shower, Veylith said, "I must be direct with you, Dr. Morrow. What you did today exposed something that I have suspected for a long time, but could not prove. Our medical system is extraordinary in controlled conditions and catastrophically fragile outside of them. We have built the most advanced healing technology in the galaxy, and we have simultaneously built an entire generation of physicians who cannot function without it." Kael listened and said nothing. Veylith continued, "I have read about human medicine, your field surgery, your trauma protocols, your emergency doctrine. Your species learned to heal in the worst conditions imaginable, and you never lost that ability even after your technology advanced. You kept the old ways alive not out of nostalgia, but because you understood something that we forgot. What is that? Kael asked that. The universe does not care about your equipment, Veylith said. The universe will take your tools and your power and your clean rooms, and it will put a dying creature on a filthy floor in front of you and ask what you can do with nothing but yourself. And you must have an answer. Kael was quiet for a moment, then said, "Yeah, that's about right." Veylith tilted their heads slightly, light refracting in new patterns, and asked, "What do humans call what you did today? Is there a name for that kind of medicine performed under those conditions?" Kael thought about it for a moment, really thought about it, then took a sip of his coffee and said, "Tuesday." Veylith stared at him. Then something happened that Tessic later told Kael had never occurred in the entire recorded history of their time at the Academophilis. Laughed. It was a strange and beautiful sound, like wind chimes caught in a storm, sharp and bright and cracking at the edges, and it echoed through the empty lecture hall and bounced off the walls and faded slowly into the hum of the station. And in that sound, Kael heard something he recognized, the sound of someone who had just realized that the galaxy was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than they had allowed themselves to believe. Kael raised his thermos in a small toast and drank, and somewhere on the lower habitat ring a Gorvathi dockworker was sleeping peacefully with 10 hand-tied stitches holding his secondary art together and an itch in his chest that meant he was going. The notice appeared on the Academy bulletin system 6 weeks after the incident in Habitat Ring 7. New elective module, Adaptive Field Medicine, Principles from Pre-Technological Medical Traditions. Instructor Dr. Kael Morrow. Human. Exchange physician. Open to all cohorts. Not exchange observer anymore, exchange physician. Nobody at the Academy commented on the change in title, but everyone noticed it on the first day of the module. The lecture hall was standing room only. Students packed into every seat and lined the walls and filled the corridor outside, trying to hear through the open doors. There were Veylani and Dothari and Sorvathi and Gorvathi and Trelki, and species that Kael had never seen before and probably could not pronounce the names of. He stood at the front of the room holding his thermos, the same dented steel thermos he had carried since Earth, and he looked out at a sea of alien faces and compound eyes and bioluminescent skin and crystalline bodies, and he smiled. Then he held up 2 things, a length of sterile fiber thread and a small curved needle. Today, he said, you are going to learn how to close a wound with your hands. He gave each student a piece of synthetic tissue, a flat pad about the size of a human palm with a clean incision cut down the middle, and a needle and thread. The room went insane. Species with tentacles could not grip the needle. It kept slipping through their appendages and clattering to the floor. Species with tremor-prone hands could not hold the thread steady enough to pass it through the tissue. A Gorvathi student in the back row accidentally crushed 3 needles in a row because his fingers were too strong for the delicate work. Tessic, who had come not as a student but as something between a volunteer assistant and someone who simply could not stay away, discovered that having 4 hands made suturing exponentially harder. Every time 2 hands found a rhythm, the other 2 interfered, and they ended up tangling the thread into a knot that took 7 minutes to undo. Sat very still and focused, and their skin shifted through a slow progression of frustrated colors, amber to rust to deep crimson, as they tried again and again to make a single clean stitch, and failed, and tried again. Kael watched all of this with a patience that had no bottom. He walked between the stations and helped each student individually, adjusting grips and showing angles and demonstrating the motion over and over, slow and steady and always the same. Push through, pull through, loop and tie. Push through, pull through, loop and tie. He never raised his voice, and he never showed frustration. And when a student failed for the 20th time, he simply said, try again. Your hands are learning. Let them learn after. An hour he stood at the front again and said, I want to be clear about something. Mastering this technique is not the point of this course. Most of you will never need to suture a wound by hand. Your technology will handle it. The point is understanding something much more important. He paused and looked at them, and his eyes were serious in a way they had not seen before. Not the calm focus of the surgery or the easy warmth of daily conversation, but something deeper and older. The tough point, he said, is understanding that medicine does not stop when the machines do. He let that sit in. The silence, your nanites will fail. Your resonance fields will lose power. Your reconstruction chambers will malfunction. And on that day, whatever day it is wherever you are, a patient will be in front of you dying, and the only thing left will be you. Your hands, your knowledge, your willingness to act. And if you have never practiced working without your tools, you will freeze, just like you froze in that market. And your patient will die, not because you were not smart enough, but because you are not ready. Nobody in the room made a sound now. Kael said, pick up your needles and try again. Module ran for 16 weeks, and by the end of it, something had changed in the academy that went beyond. As single course students started carrying small emergency kits that were not standard issue, kits that included manual tools and sterile thread and basic clamps, things that did not require power or calibration, things that would work. In the dark and the cold and the chaos, instructors from other departments started attending Kael's lectures, sitting in the back rows and taking notes on data pads. Kael pretended not to notice, but Tessic told him, and he just shrugged and said good. They should hear this too. The Gorvathy dock worker, whose name was Grath, came to the academy one afternoon, fully healed with a long scar across his lower torso that the reconstruction chamber had offered to remove, and that he had refused. He found Kael in the hallway and stood before him and placed one of his 6 massive hands on Kael's shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so large. Grath spoke in his own language, low and rumbling like stones settling, and Tessic translated, he says you carry his life in your hands now. That is a Gorvathy bond. It means wherever you go in the galaxy, he will answer if you call. Kael looked up at the massive alien and said, tell him the scar looks good on him. Grath laughed, a sound like a minor earthquake, and walked away. Weeks later, on a quiet evening cycle, Tessic found Kael on the observation deck of Veylith Orbital. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the viewport wall and his thermos beside him, and the stars spread out behind him in an endless field of cold light. Millions of suns in every direction. And he was just sitting there looking at nothing and everything. Tessic sat down beside him, folding their long, segmented legs beneath them, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Then Tessic said something that had been building inside them for weeks. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer. Honestly, Kael nodded during the surgery. When the Gorvathy's vitals were dropping and the membrane was tearing and everything was falling apart, you were calm, completely calm. I watched your hands, and they did not shake. Not once. How is that possible? Were you not afraid? Kael did not answer right away. He looked at the stars and took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the easy humor and the warmth, down to something raw underneath. I was terrified. He said. Tessic turned to look at him every time. Kael said, every single time I put my hands on a patient, I am terrified. I have been doing this for 12 years, and it has never gotten easier. The fear is always there right at the start, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. Then how? Tessic asked. Kael was quiet for a long moment, and then he told them about the first patient he ever lost, a young soldier barely 20, caught in a blast that tore open his abdomen. Kael was 22 and fresh out of training, and he tried. God, he tried. His hands were inside that boy's body trying to stop the bleeding, and it would not stop. It just kept coming, warm and fast and too much. And the boy looked at him and said, am I going to be okay, Dak and Kael said yes, because what else do you say? And then the boy closed his eyes, and his body went still, and Kael was kneeling in a puddle of blood, holding organs that had already stopped. Working Tessic did not move. I carry him. Kael said, I carry all of them. Every patient I lost and every patient I saved. They are all in my hands. And when I kneel beside someone who is dying, the fear comes and it says you might fail again, and I say I know. And then I start working anyway, because that is the only answer I have ever found. Looked at Tessic, and his eyes were bright but steady. It is not that humans do not feel fear, Tessic. We feel it all the time. We feel it so much that we had to learn how to work with it sitting right there beside us. Not gone, not conquered, not suppressed, just present. Like a weight you carry so long it becomes part of your balance. Tessic was silent for a very long time. The stars turned slowly outside the viewport. Ancient light from ancient suns crossing the void between worlds. Then Tessic said, I think I understand now why humans are the way they are. Tell me. Kael said, it is not that you are stronger or faster or smarter than other species. You are not. Your bodies are fragile and your lifespans are short and your technology is young. But somewhere in your history, very early, before you had tools or ships or medicine, that worked. You decided something that most species never had to decide. What do we decide? Kael asked. That fear was not a good enough reason to stop trying. Words hung in the air between them, simple and plain and carrying a weight that pressed against the walls of the station and the hull of the orbital and the skin of the stars themselves. Kael looked at Tessic and something passed between them that was not translatable into any language, human or alien. A recognition that crossed every boundary of species and biology and history. The understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. Kael smiled, slow and real and tired and warm. He picked up his thermos and raised it toward the stars in a small, quiet toast. That's the whole trick, he said, and somewhere out in the galaxy, on 1,000 different worlds, in 1,000 different crises, humans were kneeling beside the broken and the bleeding and the dying, hands steady and hearts terrified and absolutely refusing to stop. Because that was the whole trick that had always been the whole trick, and the